The annual inventory of a lighthouse supply cupboard. The morning came to the island the way it always did, without announcement, without hurry, the grey light seeping in from the edge of the sea and spreading slowly across the water until the whole world was the soft colour of pewter and wool. There was no sunrise to speak of, not really, only a gradual lightening, a patient brightening of the mist, as though someone very far away were turning up a lamp by the smallest amount each minute and was content to take all morning about it. The keeper of the lighthouse stood at the foot of the tower with a ring of keys in his hand, and he was in no rush at all, because there was nothing on this particular day that needed rushing, and indeed there was nothing on most days that needed rushing, which was one of the many quiet pleasures of his work. It was the day of the annual inventory. He had circled it in pencil on the calendar that hung in the small kitchen, though the truth was that he kept the date more in his bones than in any written note, the way certain old men keep the date of the first frost or the turning of the tide. Once a year, when the autumn storms had not yet quite arrived but the summer was thoroughly finished, he would open the supply cupboard at the base of the lighthouse and count everything inside it, slowly and carefully, and write it all down in a soft pencil in a ledger with a cloth cover. There was no one to whom he was obliged to report these numbers in any great hurry, and no one waiting on the mainland to scold him if a flask of oil were miscounted by one. The inventory was simply a thing he did, a small ceremony of order in a place where order was a kind of comfort, and he had come to look forward to it the way some people look forward to a long train journey through a flat and gentle countryside, with nothing to see but fields and the occasional cow. The cupboard was set into the thick stone wall at the base of the tower, and its door was a broad and heavy thing of dark old timber, painted long ago a soft sea green that had faded now to the color of lichen on a north-facing rock. The key for it was the largest on the ring, a great iron key with a looped handle worn smooth by many years of palms, and he fitted it now into the lock and turned it with a slow and satisfying click, a sound he had heard 1,000 times and never tired of. The door did not swing open by itself, for it was too heavy and too snug in its frame for that, so he set his shoulder gently against it and eased it back, and it gave way with a long low groan of hinges that wanted oiling, a groan he rather liked, the sort of sound an old dog makes when it stretches by the fire. Inside, the cupboard was cool and still and smelled of all the things it held, which is to say it smelled of oil and brass and rope and old wood and the faint sweetness of candle wax, all mingled together into a single smell that was the smell of the cupboard and of no other place in the world. It was a smell he knew so well that he hardly noticed it any more, except on this one morning each year, when opening the door after a season of leaving it shut released it all at once, and he stood for a moment on the threshold and breathed it in, and felt that the year had turned, properly turned, the way a page turns in a book you are reading slowly and have no wish to finish. He left the door propped open with a small stone he kept just for that purpose, a flat grey stone smoothed by the sea, and the cool morning air came drifting in from outside, carrying with it the salt of the water and the faint mineral tang of wet rock and the distant, soft, almost not there cry of a gull somewhere out over the swell. The air moved through the cupboard gently, stirring nothing, only freshening the cool dim space and mingling with the older smells, and the keeper thought, as he thought every year, that there was something pleasant about letting the outside in for a while, about reminding the stored and shelved and folded things that there was still a sea out there, still a sky, still weather doing its slow grey business above the water. He had brought with him a few simple tools for the task, and he set them out now on a small wooden stool just inside the door, the way a careful man lays out what he will need before he begins. There was the ledger, of course, with its soft grey cloth cover and its pages gone slightly soft and cottony with age and handling. There was the pencil, a stub of a thing he had sharpened with his pocket knife the night before so that it would write smoothly and not need fussing over. There was a clean cloth, folded into a neat square, for the dusting. And there was a small lantern, though he scarcely needed it yet, for the morning light was finding its way in through the one small window high in the cupboard wall, a window of thick old glass that let in the light but blurred the world beyond it into soft shapes of grey and green and pearl. He stood for a while longer than was strictly necessary, simply looking at the shelves, letting his eyes travel over them the way a shepherd lets his eyes travel over a hillside of sheep, not counting yet, only seeing, only taking in the comfortable familiar shape of it all. The shelves rose from floor to ceiling along 3 of the walls, sturdy planks of dark wood set on iron brackets, sagging just slightly in the middle from the patient weight of years, and on them sat the whole quiet inventory of his life and his work, the flasks and tins and coils and folded cloths, each in its place, each waiting to be counted, none of it going anywhere, none of it in any hurry, all of it perfectly content to be exactly where it was. He began, as he always began, with the lamp oil. The flasks of lamp oil sat on the lowest broad shelf along the wall beneath the little window, where the light fell softest and the floor was coolest, for oil keeps best away from warmth and sun, and there was little enough of either on this island in any case. They were stout flasks of thick glass with metal caps, each one filled with a clear pale oil that caught the grey window light and held it, so that when he lifted the first one and turned it in his hands the oil within seemed to glow very faintly, a soft and golden glow like weak tea, like winter honey, like the light of a candle seen through a frosted pane. He set the flask down on the floor near the window where the light was best, and then he lifted the second, and turned it, and set it down beside the first, and then the third, and the fourth, and so on, lining them up one beside the other along the cool stone floor beneath the window in a neat and orderly row. It was a slow business, lifting and turning and setting down, and he did not try to hurry it, for hurrying was not the point. He liked the weight of each flask in his hands, the cool smoothness of the glass, the small slosh of the oil as he lifted it, the way the level shifted and settled. He liked the soft clink the metal caps made when one flask was set down a little too near its neighbor, and the way he could nudge them into a straighter line with one finger, just so, until the whole row stood as even as soldiers, as even as fence posts, as even as the slow waves coming in. He counted them under his breath as he went, not aloud exactly, but in a low murmur meant for no ears but his own. 1, 2, 3, 4, the numbers falling soft and round into the quiet of the cupboard. When the row was complete and every flask stood gleaming faintly in the window light, he stepped back and counted them again, this time pointing with the stub of his pencil, touching the air above each cap in turn, to be quite sure he had not muddled himself, for it is an easy thing to lose your count when the counting is so pleasant that your mind drifts off to other matters, to the weather, to the gulls, to nothing at all. There were 16 flasks. There had been 16 flasks last year, more or less, perhaps a few more, for he laid in a fresh supply each summer when the supply boat came, and used what he used through the dark months, and so the number rose and fell a little from year to year like a tide that never quite came all the way in or went all the way out. He opened the ledger to the proper page, and licked the tip of his pencil out of old habit though it needed no licking, and wrote, in his small, slow, careful hand, the word oil, and beside it the number 16, and beside that the date. The pencil made a soft, dry, whispering sound on the soft old paper, a sound very like the sound of the sea heard from far inland, a sound very like a person breathing slowly in their sleep, and he listened to it as he wrote, and found it good. Then he closed the ledger upon his finger to keep the place, and looked again at the row of flasks gleaming in the window light, and thought that there was something deeply satisfying about a thing counted and known, a number written down, a quantity settled and recorded and put beyond all doubt. The oil would not run out before spring, there was more than enough, the light would burn through every dark night of the coming winter, steady and golden, sweeping out across the water, and he had now the proof of it written in pencil in a cloth-covered book, and the knowledge of it sat warm and comfortable in his chest like a good breakfast. He left the flasks where they stood for the moment, lined up beneath the window, because he liked the look of them there and saw no reason to put them back too soon, and he moved on to the next shelf, which held the brass polish and the wicks and the spare lenses, the small precious things, the things he handled with particular care. The brass polish came in flat round tins with lids that had to be prized off with a thumbnail, and inside was a soft pinkish paste that smelled sharply of something clean and chemical and faintly of lavender, a smell that always made him think, for some reason he could never quite trace, of his grandmother's kitchen and of Sunday afternoons very long ago. He did not open the tins now, for there was no need. He only lifted each one and gave it a small shake to feel whether it was full or half or nearly empty, and judged the matter by the weight and the slow soft shift of the paste within. There were 4 tins, and one was nearly done, scraped thin around the edges from the long faithful business of keeping the great lamp's brasswork bright, and 3 were full or nearly so, heavy and solid in the hand. He wrote it down. Brass polish, for tins, 1 near empty. The pencil whispered. The window glass glowed grey and soft. Somewhere outside, far off, the gull cried again, once, and then thought better of it and was silent. The wicks were kept in a long shallow drawer that slid out from beneath the lens shelf with a small reluctant scrape, and inside they lay coiled like sleeping things, soft and pale and flat, woven of cotton and ready to drink up the oil and burn clean and bright. He did not need to handle these much. He only slid the drawer out and looked at them lying there in their soft pale coils, and counted the coils with his eyes, and judged that there were a great many, more than enough, a whole winter's worth and more besides, for a wick lasts a good long while and he was not careless with them. He ran one fingertip very gently along the topmost coil, just to feel the soft dry weave of it, and then he slid the drawer closed again, slowly, so that it would not stick or jam, and he wrote in the ledger, "Wicks, plentiful," and looked at the word plentiful for a moment, pleased with it, for it was a comfortable word, a generous word, a word with no worry in it anywhere. The spare lenses were the most precious things in the whole cupboard, and he came to them last among the small things and handled them most carefully of all. They were kept high on the shelf, each one wrapped in its own square of soft grey flannel and laid in a wooden box lined with more flannel still, so that they could not knock against one another or against the wood. He lifted the box down with both hands, slowly, and set it on the little stool, and he unwrapped each lens just enough to see the curved glass within, the thick clear glass ground smooth and true, the glass that could take a small flame and gather its light and throw it out across the dark water for miles and miles, further than any man could walk in a day. He did not unwrap them fully, for there was no need, and a wrapped lens is a safe lens, but he peeled back a corner of each flannel square and looked at the glass beneath, and saw that it was clean and whole and clear, with no chip or crack or cloudiness, and then he folded the flannel back over it, snug and soft, and laid it gently in its place. There were 3 spare lenses, as there had always been 3, and he counted them twice for good measure, for these were not things one wished to be mistaken about, and then he wrapped the box again in its outer cloth and lifted it back to its high shelf, settling it square and true against the wall where it would sit untroubled through the winter. He wrote in the ledger, "Spare lenses, 3, all sound," and he underlined the words "all sound" with a small slow stroke of the pencil, not because it needed underlining but because it pleased him to do it, the way a man will pat the head of a child who has done nothing in particular except be there and be well. By now the morning had brightened as much as it was going to, which was not very much, and the light in the cupboard had settled into a steady soft grey that would last all day, and the keeper found that he had come to the old clock, and he stopped his counting for a while, because the clock asked to be wound. The clock stood on a shelf of its own near the door, an old clock in a case of dark wood with a round white face gone yellow as old paper and black iron hands and a small brass key hanging from a hook beside it on a faded ribbon. It was not a clock that anyone particularly needed, for the keeper kept his own hours by the light and the dark and the tides, and the great lamp above had its own clockwork that he tended separately and with great attention. But this small clock had always stood in the cupboard, since long before his time, set there by some keeper now long gone, and it had a way of keeping the time as long as it was wound, and a way of stopping, patiently and without complaint, whenever it was not. It had stopped now, he saw. The hand stood at some hour that had nothing to do with the present hour, frozen at a moment from some time in the past spring when last he had wound it, and the face was still and the case was silent. He took the small brass key from its hook and fitted it into the hole in the clock's face, and he turned it, gently, feeling the spring inside tighten with each turn, a small firm resistance growing under his fingers, until the spring was wound full and would turn no more, and then he drew the key out and hung it back on its hook on its faded ribbon. For a moment the clock was still silent, gathering itself, the way a sleeper takes a breath before waking, and then he reached up with one finger and gave the pendulum the smallest of nudges, and it began to swing, slow and steady, side to side, and the clock began to tick. The ticking filled the cupboard, soft and steady and unhurried, a small dry patient sound, tick and tark, and tick and tark, each tick exactly like the one before it and the one after, each one falling into the cool quiet air and being followed by another, and the keeper stood and listened to it for a long while, longer than he meant to, longer than the winding had taken. Because there was something about the sound of an old clock beginning to tick again in a quiet room that asked a man to stop and listen. He thought of all the years the clock had ticked in this cupboard, ticking through long winters when no one heard it, ticking in the dark behind the closed and locked door, marking off the minutes and the hours that no one was counting, faithful and steady and entirely unbothered by the fact that there was no one there to mind. And then someone would come, once a year, and wind it, and listen, and the ticking would go on a while longer, and then run down again, and stop, and wait. It seemed to him a fine sort of life for a clock to have, a patient and undemanding life, and he stood and listened to the tick and the tark and the tick until he felt quite rested by it, though he had not been tired, and then he gathered himself and went back to his counting. The next shelves held the larger things, the rope and the candles and the folded sailcloth, and these were the things he most enjoyed handling, for they were honest and weighty and good to put in order, and there was a real pleasure in the smoothing and the stacking of them. The rope was wound in great coils, thick brown rope that smelled of tar and hemp and the sea, and it lay heaped upon its shelf in loops and rings, some of them gone a little loose and untidy over the seasons, slumped sideways the way a coil of rope will slump when no hand has touched it for a while. He took each coil down in turn, and it was heavy, pleasantly heavy, and he held it in the crook of his arm and ran his hand around the loops to true them up, smoothing the rope, drawing it round into neat even rings, tightening the coil and tucking the loose end through and round so that it would hold, and then he set it back upon the shelf, squared away, tidy, a thing in order. The rope was rough under his hands but not unkindly so, and it left upon his palms the faint clean smell of tar that he liked, and he counted the coils as he went, for of them, all sound, all good strong rope with plenty of years left in it, and he wrote it down, rope, for coils, good. The candles came next, in their flat box, plain candles of pale wax that he used in the lower rooms of the tower and in the kitchen on the long dark evenings, for the great lamp above was for the sea and not for reading by. He lifted them out a few at a time and laid them in rows and counted them, and they were cool and smooth and slightly waxy to the touch, and they made a soft clean sound when they knocked together, a soft wooden clack like the sound of dominoes laid down gently on a table. There were a great many candles, more than he would burn in a single winter, for he had laid in extra the last time the boat came and was glad of it now, and he stacked them back in their box in neat rows, all lying the same way, all pointing the same direction, the wicks all at one end like a little field of pale stalks, and he wrote in the ledger, candles, ample, and was pleased once more by the comfortable roundness of the word. The sailcloth was folded and stacked upon the broadest shelf of all, heavy folded lengths of canvas, stiff and pale and faintly grey, the cloth he used for mending and covering and 100 small repairs about the tower and the outbuildings. The folds had gone a little askew over the season, the corners no longer quite matching, the stack leaning slightly to one side the way a stack of anything will lean if it is left alone long enough, and he took the topmost length down and shook it out a little, not all the way, just enough to find its true folds again, and then he folded it once more, carefully, corner to corner, edge to edge, smoothing each fold flat with the side of his hand, pressing the air out of it, and laid it down square upon the shelf. The canvas was stiff and rough and smelled of dust and salt and old weather, and there was a deep and simple satisfaction in folding it well, in making the corners meet exactly, in pressing the stack down flat and even, and he worked his way through the whole pile this way, unfolding and folding and smoothing and stacking, until the sailcloth lay in a neat square tower of grey, every fold true, every corner square, the whole stack standing as tidy as a stack of fresh-cut paper. He wrote it in the ledger, sailcloth, 6 lengths, sound, and he straightened up and put his hand to the small of his back, for he had been bending over the low shelves a good while now, and he looked at the candles in their box and the rope in its coils and the sailcloth in its neat grey tower, and he felt the quiet pleasure of work done slowly and done well, the pleasure of a morning spent in the company of useful things, putting them in order, counting them, knowing them, setting them right. For the winter. The clock ticked on near the door, steady and soft, tick and tack and tick, and the cool air still drifted in from the propped-open door, salt and mineral and faintly green, and the light in the little high window was the same soft pearl grey it had been all morning and would be all day. It was while he was reaching to the very back of one of the lower shelves, behind the stack of sailcloth, feeling about with his hand to be sure he had missed nothing, that his fingers met something cool and round and metal that he had quite forgotten was there, and he drew it out into the light, and found that it was the biscuit tin. It was an old tin, round and flat, with a lid that fitted snugly down over the side, and it was painted, or had once been painted, with a faded picture of some pleasant scene now too worn and dim to make out properly, a few flowers perhaps, a bit of blue sky, the suggestion of a garden, all gone soft and ghostly with the years. He turned it in his hands and remembered, dimly, that it had been there a long time, that it had been there last year when he counted, and the year before that too, sitting at the back of the shelf behind the sailcloth where it was easy to forget. He gave it a small shake, and something inside it shifted with a soft dry rattle, and he supposed there were biscuits in it still, or what had once been biscuits, sealed up tight in the cool dark for years now, neither growing better nor, he thought, growing very much worse, simply waiting, the way everything in the cupboard waited. He thought about opening it. He stood there with the tin in his hands and the lid under his thumb, and he thought about prizing it open and seeing what was inside, and perhaps it would be fine, perhaps the biscuits would be quite as good as the day they were sealed in, dry and sweet and waiting, or perhaps they would be soft and stale and not worthy eating, and he found, turning the matter over slowly in the cool quiet air with the clock ticking beside him, that he did not really want to know. There was something pleasant about the tin precisely because it was closed, precisely because it held its small secret undisturbed, precisely because it had sat there for years being a mystery and a possibility and a small forgotten treasure, and to open it would be to settle the matter one way or the other and to lose the gentle not knowing of it. And besides, he thought, if he opened it and the biscuits were good, he would eat them, and then they would be gone, and there would be no biscuit tin at the back of the shelf next year, and if he opened it and they were stale, he would have to throw them out, and there would still be no biscuit tin next year, and either way the cupboard would be the poorer for it by one small comfortable mystery. So he decided, as he had decided last year, and the year before, though he had forgotten deciding it, that he would leave the biscuit tin where it was, unopened, for another year. He gave it one more gentle shake, just to hear again the soft dry rattle of whatever waited inside, and then he set it back at the very rear of the lower shelf, behind the sailcloth, in its dim cool corner, and pushed it back until it touched the stone of the wall, and patted it once, the way one pats something one is fond of, and left it there. He did not write the biscuit tin in the ledger. The biscuit tin was not, properly speaking, supplies. It was something else, something more like an old friend who lived quietly at the back of the cupboard and asked nothing of anyone, and he saw no reason to set it down in pencil among the oil and the rope and the candles. It was enough that it was there, and that he knew it was there, and that it would be there again next year when he came to count. And with that, the keeper found that he was very nearly done. He went back round the shelves once more, slowly, the way he liked to finish, gathering up his counting, returning the flasks of oil to their proper places one by one, lifting each from the row beneath the window and carrying it back and setting it down upon its shelf, until the whole gleaming row was put away and the floor beneath the window was bare again, and the window's soft grey light fell now upon empty stone where the flasks had stood. He folded his dusting cloth and ran it once gently over the edges of the shelves and along the tops of the tins and the lids of things, lifting the thin year's dust from them, the cloth coming away grey and soft, and he dusted the things he would not need until spring, the spare lenses in their box high on the shelf, the extra candles, the coils of rope, smoothing his cloth over them gently, almost tenderly, the way one tidies a room that will be shut up for the season, putting it in good order. Not because anyone will see it, but because it deserves to be left well. Then he came to the little stool by the door, and he sat down upon it, and he took up the ledger, and he read back through the day's work, down the column in his own small slow pencil hand: oil 16, brass polish for tins, wicks plentiful, spare lenses 3 all sound, rope for coils good, candles ample, sailcloth 6 lengths sound, and he found it all in order, all counted, all known, all written down beyond any doubt, and he felt the deep and simple satisfaction of it settle over him, like a warm blanket drawn up to the chin. There was enough of everything. There was more than enough. The winter could come now, the storms could come, the long dark nights could come, and the great lamp would burn steady and golden through every one of them, and there would be oil to feed it and wicks to carry the flame and polish to keep its brass bright and spare lenses safe in their flannel against any mishap, and rope and candles and canvas for all the small needs of the season, and at the back of the shelf, behind the sailcloth, a biscuit tin keeping its quiet mystery for another year. He closed the ledger softly upon its column of numbers, and laid his hand flat upon its soft grey cloth cover, and let out a long slow breath, content. And just then, far off across the water, faint and low and softened by the mist, the foghorn sounded. It was the foghorn from the headland on the far side of the bay, a great low note that came rolling slow across the grey water and over the rocks and in through the open cupboard door, a deep soft sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound more felt than heard, settling in the chest like the lowest note of a great organ played very far away. It sounded once, long and low, and then it was quiet, and then after a while it sounded again, patient and steady, calling out across the dim afternoon to whatever ships might be feeling their slow way through the mist, telling them gently where the land was and where it was not, telling them to take care, to go slow, to mind the rocks, all in that one long low unhurried note that asked for nothing and offered only its steady patient comfort. The keeper sat on the little stool and listened to it, and to the soft answer of the clock ticking beside him, the great far low note of the horn and the small near dry tick of the clock, the two of them together in the cool grey quiet, and he thought there were few sounds in all the world he liked so well. He sat a while longer, for there was no reason to get up. Then, slowly, he rose from the stool, and he gathered his few tools, the ledger, and the pencil and the folded cloth and the little lantern he had never needed to light, and he carried them out through the open door into the soft grey afternoon. The mist had drawn in a little closer now, and the world beyond the lighthouse was a gentle blur of grey water and grey sky with no line between them, and the air was cool and damp and tasted of salt, and the foghorn sounded again, far off, low and slow. He bent and took up the flat grey stone that had held the door, the smooth sea stone, and set it aside in its place by the wall, and then he set his shoulder gently to the heavy green door and eased it closed, and it swung to with the same long low groan of hinges, settling snug into its frame, shutting the cool dim cupboard away with all its counted things inside, the oil and the polish and the rope and the candles and the folded canvas, and the old clock ticking softly in the dark, and the biscuit tin keeping its secret at the back of the shelf. He fitted the great iron key into the lock and turned it, and felt the slow heavy click of the bolt going home, and drew the key out and hung it on its ring among the others, and that was the inventory done, counted and recorded and closed and locked away for another year. And then there was nothing left to do but to go up and rest. He turned to the spiral stair that wound up the inside of the tower, the worn stone steps curling up and up around the central column into the dimness above, and he began to climb, slowly, one hand resting light upon the cool iron rail, taking each step without hurry, for there was no hurry, there was never any hurry, and his footsteps fell soft and even upon the worn stone, one and then another, round and up and up. The foghorn sounded once more, fainter now, muffled by the thick stone walls, a low far comfortable note fading into the dim. The light from the little window set into the stair grew softer as he climbed, greyer, gentler, the long grey afternoon settling down toward the long grey evening, and the keeper climbed slowly up through it, round and round, his hand upon the cool rail, his steps soft and slow and even, going up at last to rest, with everything below him counted and in order, everything safe, everything known, everything quietly waiting through the winter, while the clock ticked softly in the locked dark cupboard, and the horn called low across the water, and the mist drew in, and the grey light dimmed, and all was still.